This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
So I'm just going to come straight in because I'm building on the ideas that you talked about. That I'm going to briefly introduce myself. My name is Flora Pitrolo, and I have a PhD from Drama Theatre and Performance Department at Roehampton, where I wrote a thesis about the Italian sort of experimental performance in the late 70s and early 1980s in Italy. And most of what I've been writing about is performance, but not only, and now what I'm doing is I'm working on a couple of projects, one which sort of takes various cultural artifacts of the cusp between the 1970s and the 1980s and examines them in terms of the long shadow of the 1970s, and in terms of this concept of reflusso, and in concept of in terms of the concept of banal, which interests me very much. Banal art in the early 1980s in Italy. And the other thing that I'm sort of thinking about is how Italian postmodernism might be out of line with American French postmodernism, as are, I think, many other, at least Southern European postmodernities. So that's the sort of, my ambition is to sort of start a collective conversation around that with other scholars writing about similar things, and I think now the 80s are coming into historicization, so that's what I'm working on. And I'm at Kent. That's where I am at the moment. So what I'm offering here is some thoughts that I've developed as a spectator of Irene's work, Italians 2001, over the course of the past few years, and concentrating in particular on this interview, which Irene let me hear, told me about in January last year, and she immediately singled it out as an axis which the entire project could rotate on. The ground I'm working from is that the zeitgeistness that Liverani is working on, and she is working on a zeitgeist, and it's a zeitgeist treated in memory through making a collective work of art, could be looked at in the frame of what in my work I call the affective stance of a particular era or generation. Affective stance is a term which I've developed in part from current work on affect, but also very indebted to Raymond Williams' idea of the structure of feeling, and it's a term that I use in the broad field of performance and performance theory. So that's the ground. I use this term affective stance to describe those widespread diffused positions which are both the result of, and in some cases the source of, a particular political situation at a time and place. And for me, an affective stance is usually not interceptable in the annales of this world, if you will. But you might perceive an affective stance in between the recorded events, and certainly through works of art, because it's often something that regards more the imagination of a time than the events of a time, and also often might regard what didn't happen at a certain point, rather than necessarily what did. It seems to me something that can help us take the wholes into account, which is something I'm quite interested in. As a general mood, which is emotional but also very collective, it's something which is acted out in between the fabric of events, and I think this is essentially what we see here in this interview that Irene has conducted. So while my work concerns mostly the affective stance of the Italian 1980s, I very much welcome the challenge of thinking about this moment, the moment, quello era il momento, of the Genova G8 through Irene's work. There are three moments of this interview that I've singled out as if it were a script. So I'm almost treating it as if it were something that was prepared for performance. So I'm keeping in mind that there's a future in performance in this work. And I'll occasionally also refer both to the interview and to past stages of the project. So the first sentence I want to single out from the interview is towards the beginning, a will to think in a more precise manner. This question of bringing about a will to think in a more precise manner. Brief looking back to earlier stages. So one of the first movements of Italians 2001 consisted of Liverani interviewing a series of people born in the mid-1980s, asking them to remember 2001. She was asking for a lesser degree of political analysis than what happens in this interview, if we can call it political analysis. In fact, these questions were peppered with questions about where we were, what we were doing, how we felt, what we were listening to. There was a big focus on songs. I think 5 songs or 10 songs that you remember from 2001.
It was one each, but they had
but they made a playlist.
Like objects too,
and objects, that's right. So there was this sort of relationship with the year. So it seemed to me that in that stage of the project, Irene wasn't hunting for precision of our memory of the time. She was hunting for the atmosphere of 2001. And she was also, in my view, trying to intercept the strange mnemonic fabric in which events that aren't related end up being related. So I think she was also asking how an image of a time is, how we remember, but also how we represent a time for ourselves through memory. So she had some lead questions that I think already were a specific set of methods that illuminated an interest on how we bring certain things to mind and what the specific conditions of bringing to mind were in relation to Genova 2001. So my initial questions to these answers when Irene asked me were very local, my initial answers to these questions were very local answers. I was also not in Genoa, and in fact I was in Palermo. And I think I was giving very, even provincial answers to Irene's questions. In general, my Palermitan youth came with a sense generationally of being stuck down here, which was generally the effective stance of the people I were frequenting. You know, I don't even know if that many people felt particularly Italian. It was a sense of, okay, we're down here, Genoa's all the way up there, there's a bit of a, we're down here. And so, I don't know how important it was in the narrative around me. It was important, but it was one of a series of events. And so I guess Irene asking me how I remembered it, I realized that actually with the G8, I remembered a whole series of other things that happened maybe in the space of 2 or 3 years around that time. And looking seriously at what happened when, I realized that I was thinking about firstly, the UN Global Crime Conference, which happened in Palermo that year in December 2000. The G7 conference, also in Palermo on the 27th of February 2001. These were all quite quiet events. But the global crime one there was quite an emotional response to it, for obvious reasons. The G8 in Genoa, 21st and 2nd of July. The attack on the World Trade Center in New York on the 11th of September 2001. And very strangely, because it's 2 years later, the Italian blackout of the 28th of September 2003, which in Palermo lasted about 24 to 27 hours in some areas. So it was very memorable. The final event is, of course, completely unrelated, but I think we talked about it at the time when you interviewed me. And so asking myself how it ended up in there, I think it ended up in that set of memories from 2001, although it was from 2 years later, because of, for atmospheric reasons, essentially. Because it carried with it a certain, this feeling of the city falling silent, this feeling of a similar sense of dread, although it wasn't actually dreadful. It was just a very long one for a Western country in 2003, but just a blackout. So Liverani's questions for me, as I call you Liverani in the paper, Irene Liverani, for me as a participant made me realize how the image of that time had turned into something completely hazy, as if I had no historical consciousness of the events as they were happening. But when I think about the time, I also think I did have an historical consciousness. I'd been to those Palmerton marches. I was alive, I was present, I was thinking about politics in some way. But in hindsight, when Irene was asking me, I thought I had no idea what was happening. And then I listened to other interviews that were part of the project, and I realized that this feeling wasn't uncommon. The confusion that a lot of us feel and the mixture of political and emotional responses that comes with being a teenager and not completely in cognitive control of events, I think plays a central part in Irene's project. And I also think that plays the fact that we're talking about teenagers plays a central part in why trauma keeps coming up. There's Kathy Carruth in her Unclaimed Experience. She speaks about trauma as something that has to do not with the present of pain, but with its future. That is, with its future repercussions. Examined as, I quote, the response to an unexpected or overwhelming violent event or events that are not fully grasped as they occur, but return later in repeated flashbacks, nightmares, and other repetitive phenomena. In other words, I think there's something that we can draw together between the fact that Irene singles out the fact of being teenagers in this project and trauma as being generally accompanied by the sense of not fully grasping in the moment and maybe only managing to piece together later. Although they exist on two different planes, I think there's something similar in the way an episode might be dealt with. In this interview, B offers an explanation of Giuliani's death as not making sense, but if it did make sense, I quote, a me personalmente ha regalato per qualche breve momento una sorta di rabbia ancora maggiore che è scaturita in una voglia di pensare in un modo più preciso, più studiato anche, se vuoi. So D intervenes after that with the question of the G8 events giving cohesion to antagonistic movements. Irene questions that. D says it did because it went from the idea of vivere il casino to something more ideologically grounded. So there are three different ideas on the table here. The first, B's, is very individual, I think. A brief increased anger, and I'm also very interested in the fact that the two speak of anger and rage, anger and enthusiasm. Almost the two concepts at one point bleed into one in the interview. A brief increased anger, a flare of anger, which ended up giving him a desire for thoughtfulness, a desire to understand what was happening, a desire to study things, to be attentive towards what was happening. The second idea, Dees sort of collectivizes B's individual stance because he says, okay, we went from the idea of making a mess to the idea of actually being in a collective, organized form. And the third position is Irene, who says, really, wondering if that's true. And I really think in moments such as this, the interfering agent is the fact that these individuals were adolescents at the time. Raquel R, actually, at the start, puts this on the table. She's acutely aware at the very beginning of the interview of, oh, it was a long summer, everything was light. She's very aware that this exists in her 15 years. But more than the general lightness, the processes described by B and D are processes of stopping and thinking, which in the end are typical of any teenager's life. And we could even imagine that the G8 could even be seen in this text as simply a coincidence. It happened to be the moment of awakening in these people's lives. The fact that this is so foregrounded in Italy in 2001 makes me think of how in the project Liverani stages the events of Genoa as the 48 hours of exposure that Benjamin talks about in a passage of One Way Street, which I'm going to read out. Like someone performing the giant swing on the horizontal bar, each boy spins for himself the wheel of fortune, from which, sooner or later, the momentous lot shall fall. For only that which we knew and practiced at age 15 will one day constitute our attraction. And one thing, therefore, can never be made good, having neglected to run away from home. From 48 hours exposure in those years, as in a caustic solution, the crystal of life's happiness forms. End of quote. Liverani's text, if we want to see it as this form of verbatim theatre, seems to me to insist on foregrounding the tension between the mood, the impression, the atmosphere that follows you about as you continue to live, and the rip, the flash, the blitz, the gassy range of thoughts and feelings that then hardens into a future consciousness, into a stance. Genoa is very much positioned in this work as the pivotal but unclear event of a generation. The confusion is heightened by adolescence, but adolescence seem to be the perfect frame to stage it in because of the openness to the flash, because of that caustic solution you might be particularly aware of, open to when you're 15. The way the material is staged, I think, illuminates two things: the role of Genoa in the lives of Italians 2001, and the general lack of clarity of Genoa in its aftermath. So Genoa as unclear, maybe even for those who were able to understand it. The second thing I want to single out is something that R says a lot of times in this interview, which is, and nothing happened, and nothing happened. E non è successo niente, non è successo niente. So returning to trauma, so if trauma means wound, a wound, if you envisage it, enlarge it, is not an elevation on a surface, it's a dent, however deep. It isn't, as Kathy Carruth again has argued elsewhere, it isn't necessarily an addition to time, but a subtraction. Not an event in history, but a part of empty rather than full. And as Carruth sees it, it's not necessarily a symptom of the individual, but of history itself. She sort of argues that time contains wounds. It's not only our mnemonic post-fabrication of its passing that might contain a wound. I think the Genova G8 was traumatic, and I think it shows in this text, not only for what happened, but also for what didn't, which is what Kelly keeps talking about. Everybody in this interview seems to be in agreement on the fact that the story of the Genova G8 was dependent on a series of agents failing to act. Us failing, us who? Us, the most beautiful part of the world, as they put it, failing to change the system. The clear sense of having missed a chance. The Italian government's subsequent failure to punish those responsible, or indeed to punish itself, and there's the center of the conversations about that. A series of personal failures are also lined up here, more or less accompanied by varying amounts of guilt. Having been there or not been there, I couldn't be there, I was 16, or I celebrated my birthday in Barcelona. So there are these sort of, I think also very adolescent sort of positions of not accepting responsibility, but accepting a part of responsibility. And then there's a long and rather ineffectual question, I think, about whether one would have or would not have thrown a rock, which takes up a long time of the conversation. We are not better than our fathers, someone says at one point. And we're not worse either. We're the same, someone says. But I guess what we can see from this interview is that what we do lack is some sort of mythical narrative to hook our lives onto. We're not able to tell our children about an era of political euphoria. Not that many people are able to tell those stories, but a lot of people are able to tell at least, if not about the way they changed the world, but at least the fun they had, or the love they felt for an ideal, or the euphoria of being part of a wider, bigger social body. This, I think, from this text, it interviews that this is a subtracted narrative for the Italians 2001. So when the interviewers speak of having been literally helped to imagine things differently before they got to 2001, but not having done so themselves yet, I think it might have something to do with some sort of lack of foundational myth at that point. In any event, these failures or perceived failures are also intrinsically connected to the fact of Italians 2001 as a project concerned with adolescents. The tension between being an agent and being a non-agent, between the will to act and capacity to act, is central to the state of the 15 or the 16-year-old. However, it is the repercussions in the event's future, that is in what we now call our present and our past, that appear most prominently in this discussion. The death of Carlo Giuliani appears in the second part of the conversation, more as a death of hope, death of resistance, death of political possibility, death of future, death of trust, more than as a martyr whose function it is to unite a series of disparate political entities around a cause. In this logic, Giuliani's death also presents itself as yet another missed opportunity. And this is terrible, because I think this sense of the line between happening and not happening, I think if we think of Giuliani's death as a subtraction, I think it's an awful way to look at it, but I wonder if that might be playing in here as well. So the death happened and Giuliani unhappening, if you will. The fact of the wasted death, more in my view than the glorious death of the martyr, colours the aftermath of the G8. I think it colours its particular shade of mournfulness, because it's a mournfulness marked by defeat, essentially, and this is very clear in this interview. If we wanted to exaggerate, I don't think we want to exaggerate, but if we wanted to, we could say that Giuliani died a martyr for the cause of everything the no global movement was against. Died as a martyr for the cause of neoliberalist greed, for the triumph of an exploitative and often criminally globalized economy, for the complete annihilation of the state's role as guarantor of the people's democratic rights, and for the state's organs' massive repression of the right to personal safety. But I repeat, we might not want to exaggerate because it might make us feel too desperate. In any event, the nothing happened, which our interviewees insistently single out as central to life in post-Genoa, exists in firm relation to the events of September 2001 in New York, with or without conspiracy theories on making Europe and North America right-wing. If anything, I think the two events are related, at least in their future, and I think this is obvious, because September the 11th shrank the Italian situation back to Italy. Not that the whole world had spent the summer watching, but certainly the events of July lost importance on a sort of global media scale after the events of early September. Before, during, and just after Genoa, what was being confusedly named under the umbrella term of the Antiglobalization movement, or No Global in Italy, was beginning to be treated in its more moderate branches, of course, as a political force to be reckoned with. Be it as a moderating, regulating agent that could dull the sting of an ever more maniacal global financial market, or as number one enemy of the West's economical growth. But there was also an idea circulating. There are some copies of the Financial Times from the time, for example, saying that, oh, maybe this movement is something that we can, maybe it's good for us, you know. And here I want to call in another aspect of Liverani's project, that it's called Italians 2001. It's not called Young Radical Left 2001, Protesters Who Didn't Make It to the Protest 2001, Politically Engaged 16-year-olds 2001. And I think she does this for reasons that mostly have to do with the aftermath of Genoa. The early 2000s, this is banal, but I'll say it anyway, I think did come with the hubris offered by the possibilities of building some sort of network, and also with a baggage that came from previous big globalized movements that achieved something, such as the Pride movement, or such as the big environmental ecological movements of the 1990s. So in a sense, when they say the world was becoming a better, fairer place, I think that was rolled into the ideology of the late 90s and early 2000s. I also think the early 2000s came with the certainty that at least in the West, in fact only in the West, we at least were living very similar lives. So that as we, again, we fought globalization, we also had to come to terms with our own globalization as something which could be helpful, could create a global multitude. This is absolutely one of the theses in Negri and Hart's Empire, which was published in the year 2000 and which sold 40,000 copies as soon as it came out in the year 2000 on Harvard University Press. They say this as the sort of counter-argument, good globalization, bad globalization, if you will. I'm simplifying. I quote, "Empire cannot be resisted by a project aimed at a limited local autonomy. We cannot move back to any previous social form, nor move forward in isolation. Rather, we must push through empire to come out the other side. Empire can be effectively contested only on its own level of generality, and by pushing the processes that it offers past their present limitations. We have to accept that challenge and learn to think globally and act globally. Globalization must be met with a counter-globalization, empire with counter-empire," end quote. I'm insisting on this point, pointing out the sameness, all-togetherness, global leftness that made the optimistic backbone of the no global movement, to contrast this sense of collective grassroots power with the sharp and wide-ranging sense of powerlessness felt after Genoa by the movement or multitude in particular, but especially by Italians much more sharply. Because, as this is very clear in what, again, Rachele says in this interview, after Genoa, it was Italy that had turned an anti-G8 protest into a bloodbath. It was Italy's state and its policing organs that had organized or purposefully disorganized a series of brutal public repressions of what was essentially a very manageable situation. And it was our institutions that were unable to deliver any kind of, never mind justice, but sense. Because I think one of the most clear impressions from those days is, still when people watch documentaries about it or go back to investigate, is what are they doing? What are they doing? Why are they doing this? What is it? It's the sense it's actually lacking. So maybe I can hypothesize from here 3 effects that I think are clear from here. Some sort of abrupt re-provincialization of the movement and of Italy. The sense of, oh, we've shrunk to here. And actually the Italian teenagers who imagine themselves as participating in that globalized world, which was a media globalized world, global protest, global pacifism, had to think again in a certain way. The other thing I would say is an abrupt consciousness of the background of the 80s and 90s, because there's this discourse in Italy that insists on this generation born with a remote control in its mouth, and I think if there was a generation that was trying to not imagine itself that way, those events had to make them think again about how they imagined themselves, which I think was painful, and I think we're still getting over. And the third thing may be abrupt de-glorification of a generation's narrative, embodied by what Irene speaks of as the certainty that mass protest leads to nothing, but I think embodied even more powerfully by the wasted martyr of Carigliano. Third, very brief intervention that I want to make is entitled, again taking quotes from the interview, "I'd like to see those who did it at the time today," and the other quote I want to single out is, "What the fuck are we doing in the end?" Which I guess is just some brief reflections on the ghost of 1977 and things that I want to throw into the future of this day. At a BIFO lecture about the molecularization of capitalist production methods and intellectual labor, at some point at the beginning of the end of the Occupy movement here in London in 2012, he was asked at the end a whole series of questions on what is to be done then, what are we supposed to do? And I remember this very clearly, BIFO going, well, figure it out for yourselves. Figure it out for your own generation. Which I think left a very strange atmosphere in the room of, well, I'd like to see you now, exactly what is said here. While the what is to be done question, I suppose, has to be reformulated for every generation, I also think the representation of what is to be done has to be reformulated. By this I mean that the image, or the image one generation has of oneself, has a lot to do with the possible solutions it can then go on to fathom. Returning maybe to the crystal of life's happiness, as Benjamin says. I'm going to quickly skip through because I think I'm being a bit too long. Yes, I will, okay. Then another thing, just quickly, that this interview, I think, stops on is so in terms of solutions from 2001 onwards, one thing that's brought in is this idea of the movement turning from wanting to take something to this question of the please to, well, I'll just go to the countryside and start a revolution in my farm. And I think someone post-1977 might have called this last attitude reflusso verso il privato. And now we can call it in the future we can call it, I don't know, illuminated post-Fordism or hipsterized post-Fordism, or we could even call it the socially conscious petty bourgeoisie, or I don't know, maybe we don't call it bourgeoisie, or maybe we don't call it petty. In any case, the truth of all these things, I think, is more difficult than what is being made out here. I don't know if we're changing the world hectare by hectare. Also, the truth of even paying tax on these farms, the idea of getting organic status, mostly from German associations that have to deliver it to you and cost a lot of money. I'm not sure if that's the way the most beautiful part of the world is going to change the world. So the last two questions, which I think returned in 2001, returned in the Occupy movement, and returned on Thursday night in Trafalgar Square, here in London, for example, have to do two last questions that I want to put on the table. The first is, what do we think are the effective ties between the 1970s in Italy and 2001, and how two generations might have imagined themselves. So, for example, if I had been 13, 14 years old in 1977, can we retrace that story, and what can we see between putting the two situations side by side? The second question is about the please, this question of the please. Con il per favore, I can't remember what they say, but a please leads to nothing, basically. You have to take something. And I'd also like to talk with you about the nature of this please, because I wonder if it's a please that has something to do with exhaustion. And we can talk a little bit about that. I've run over. No, I haven't. Oh, good. Thank you.
Because we have 10 minutes dialogue, or do you want to take questions, or are we going to do this at the end? Because I'm sure there'll be lots of comments.
I don't know if it's, because I think it's very interesting, and if we manage to really put in parallel this experience of the years of life with the Genova G8, there's a very strong link there. But I wonder if it's better to take all the questions at the end, after we parallel the two sessions?
What do you think?
Or what do you think?
What is the consensus?
Or do we rather have like...
I mean, maybe if there are like burning things we have to speak about now.
Yes, maybe we forget in 2 hours time, or 3 minutes. Or we break for lunch.
Or we break for lunch.
I'm burning a little bit,
Okay.
because I was 12 in 1977.
Perfect. Good. I was just thinking that. I was thinking there will be some.
But one of the most striking things, well, there were two comments. One is a sort of general comment that comes from my sort of background in literary studies. And there's something interesting that Franco Moretti says about the Bildungsroman, the novel of Formazione, which is that the more that a society feels delegitimated and fragmented, the more it relies on figures of adolescents and young people to basically incarnate or encapsulate the mood of this sort of formation. And that really struck me as very pertinent to your discourse. But in terms of the, specifically of the sort of 1977, the comparison with the Movimento in 1977, the thing that struck me was the distinctive, for want of a better word, anti-utopian stance of your speakers. You know, at some point, I think Rachele says, we would like our goal should be as tolerable a situation as possible. You know, so the goal is not, as it might have been in 1977 or in the 80s, like the best possible world, you know, the best possible society we can build, but the goal is as tolerable a society as possible, which is chilling and distinctively anti-utopian from the perspective of you know what. Third thing, but it's related, is at some point Facebook comes up, and I don't know, it may be a generational thing, because I grew up in the sort of before, you know, well before the Facebook generation, but I find it very problematic that for an anti-global movement to utilize, you know, what is the most global incarnation of post-capitalism, which is Facebook.
Mm.
So how do you rhyme, how can you be both anti-global and post your things on Facebook, which is, like I said, the incarnation of global post-capitalism, if there ever was one. So these would be my burning issues. I don't know if you want to think about it, and then maybe we could come back with that.
Can I answer with a question?
Sure.
So just returning to the anti-utopianism of these speakers, for you post-77, how are you feeling with regards to utopia? If you think about sort of effective cloud of the early 80s.
Well, obviously utopia soon turned into dystopia when the terrorism, when the sort of utopian feelings of the movement in 1977 turned into violence. When the movement itself took on a very violent stance against the institutions. So, but the striking thing is that I think at every stage in the previous movement, there's a sense of wanting to build the society that we wanted, not as tolerable a society as possible, which in itself is a very self-defeatist stance to begin from.
And I think when she says that, she's talking about now, right? Because in 2001, the idea was then we could have done the cambio di rotta totale, and now the most bearable situation possible. So what's happening?
Well, I wonder if Facebook has something to do with it, because I don't know. Maybe that is my sort of particular bee in the bonnet, but I find it very problematic.
That is, it's interesting thinking back to the this question of against empire. It's the chapter that's called Against Empire in Negri and Hart's Empire. There's a kernel of that in the fact that they sort of advocate for, okay, we have to make peace with the fact that we are globalized so that we can turn into a counter-globalization. So this is obviously very problematic when they're writing this in the late 90s. They're writing a book that says, okay, I know that we hate the fact that we're globalized, but you have to turn this into a force for good so that we can be as big and as together and as forceful as they are, no?
And there was probably a very strong utopia at the time of the world, phenomenon in the media that was very glorified, as the media that could go against the media themselves. And then I think it's very interesting, I cut it from my paper, but 2001 is a moment where, at least in Italy, there is this transition from the television as the main media to the internet. And there was a lot of hope, I think, put in this network technology. And now it is kind of understood that network technology is Facebook. In a way.
I think there's a big shift between 2000 and now, which is a massively technological shift. I think there's at the heart of this, there's the nature of how the internet is used has changed, I think, very much. Because I guess maybe the internet is another missed opportunity. They said at the beginning, at the beginning of all the private radios were seen as an opportunity. They were private, but effectively, then private television wasn't seen as an opportunity. It could have been. Now there are people saying, oh, we could do something with this media, even artistically, not necessarily, but some sort of network that was not serving the usual.
I guess, yes, another thing, really extremely stimulating, both papers, lots of stuff going on in my head right now. The other anti-utopian perspective comes from the huge shift that occurred basically at the end of the Cold War, because I think, very much about the 1977 and the 1980s movement, it's very much framed within a very Cold War, which did allow for utopian thinking, and it was very clear and clear-cut, it's us and them. Post that, everything's fragmented and atomized and sort of, blown up. And so that sort of very firm, utopian attachment to certain ideologies completely, blown up.
And less, maybe even less experimental to a certain extent, less able to think of social life and political life in an experimental way. No, I think the sense of experiment or experiment, we don't even realize it's an experiment. Like, I think London is a massive neoliberalist experiment, but there's that question of, is there really no alternative, which I think is sort of, it seems so harder and harder to imagine an alternative. And then returning to Facebook, I was thinking that hackers have an enormous part in this movement now.
Yeah.
I don't know, se Fulcro si è spostato altrove, as you say in the end. I don't know,
Yes, maybe the new agents in this sort of game.
I wonder.
The hackers are the new sort of active agents.
To go back also to what you said about this book by Moretti, which I haven't read, but the figure of the adolescent as a sort of narrative.
Super interesting.
It makes me think of like the category of the unhappened, because there is this open potential in the kind of narrative of adolescence. Everything is possible, anything, like it's open. There is this idea of future, and then nothing happened, or and then so this, I think this sort of narrative of potential and defeat is integral to adolescence as a
so just
the
about
discourse.
sort of in virtus.
And then what have we become? It's something that is much more like united, or I don't know, human, also defeated, or I don't know,
I know this is
fabulous.